You're running critical infrastructure on AWS. You need direct access to the hypervisor to implement a specific security control. Can't do it. You want to inspect the physical network topology to optimize routing. Not allowed. You need to physically verify where your data is stored. You'll never see it. You want to know which other customers are running on the same physical hardware as your sensitive workloads. That information doesn't exist for you. There's a hard boundary here. On one side, things you can control, configure, and manage. On the other side, things the provider owns, decides, and will never grant you access to. That boundary is fixed. You can't negotiate around it. You can't pay enough to cross it. You can't hack through it. This is the control boundary in cloud computing. The line you can't cross. The limits you work within, not against. Let's map where your control ends and why those boundaries exist. Control boundaries are the hard limits on what you can manage, access, or modify in cloud environments. They're not soft guidelines or temporary restrictions. They're architectural, contractual, and physical limits that define the edge of your authority. These boundaries exist in layers. Technical boundaries are imposed by how the platform is built. You can't control what doesn't exist in your layer of abstraction. Policy boundaries are imposed by provider rules. You're prohibited from certain actions, even if technically possible. Business boundaries are imposed by the service model. Paying for IaaS gives you different boundaries than paying for SaaS. And regulatory boundaries are imposed by laws, data sovereignty rules that override what providers might otherwise allow. What makes boundaries different from limitations is permanence. A limitation might be temporary. Today's quota could increase tomorrow. A boundary is fundamental. The hypervisor layer will never be exposed to tenants, regardless of how much you need it, because that would break the security model that makes multi-tenancy possible. Understanding boundaries means accepting that some problems can't be solved in cloud. Some architectures can't be implemented. Some requirements can't be met. And when you hit a boundary, your options are work within it, work around it, or work elsewhere. Let's start with the technical boundaries, the control you'll never have because of how cloud platforms are architected. The hypervisor layer is completely off limits. You can't access it, modify it, inspect it, or verify its configuration. This protects multi-tenancy. If customers could touch the hypervisor, they could potentially access other customers' VMs. The boundary exists for security, but it means you can't implement security controls that require hypervisor-level access. Want to run a host-based intrusion detection system that monitors at the hypervisor layer? Impossible. That control doesn't exist for you. Physical infrastructure is invisible and inaccessible. You'll never walk into the data center where your instances run. You can't verify physical security measures directly. You can't inspect the hardware. You can't see the network cabling. You're trusting provider documentation and compliance reports, but you'll never witness physical reality firsthand. For organizations with strict audit requirements about physical verification, this boundary is a deal breaker. Low-level hardware configuration is locked. Want to modify BIOS settings? Can't do it. Want to install custom firmware? Not happening. Need to tune storage controller parameters? Not exposed. The hardware is abstracted away, which brings convenience but eliminates deep hardware optimization that some specialized workloads need. Cross-tenant visibility is completely blocked. You'll never know which other organizations are running on the same physical infrastructure as you. You can't verify that a competitor isn't on the same hardware. You can't confirm that you're not sharing resources with customers in sanctioned countries. The provider isolates tenants from each other, which protects everyone but eliminates transparency about your neighbors. Provider-side networking details remain hidden. You configure virtual networks, but you don't control how traffic actually flows through the provider's physical network. Routes might change. Traffic might traverse paths you didn't choose. Latency varies based on physical topology you can't see. You trust the provider's routing, but you can't verify or influence the actual packet paths. And you have zero control over provider operational decisions. When maintenance happens, what hardware your VMs migrate to during that maintenance, how the provider allocates physical resources, all invisible. You might request spread my instances across different physical hosts for redundancy, but you can't verify it actually happened. Beyond technical constraints, there are boundaries imposed by policy and business models. Service quotas and limits are hard boundaries until you negotiate otherwise. You can deploy 20 VPCs per region in AWS by default. That's a hard limit. Burst to 10,000 concurrent Lambda executions, hard limit. Most limits can be raised by request, but some are architectural constraints that won't budge. And during high-demand periods, even negotiated limits might not help if the provider doesn't have capacity. Platform capabilities define what's possible. Your cloud provider offers specific services with specific features. If the feature you need doesn't exist, you can't will it into existence. Want a managed database for a niche database engine the provider doesn't support? Build it yourself in IaaS, losing the managed service benefits. The platform's roadmap is controlled by the provider, not by your needs. Compliance and regulatory boundaries restrict where and how you can deploy. Data sovereignty laws might require your data stay in specific countries. Your provider might not have regions in those countries. That's a boundary. You can't use that provider for that workload. HIPAA, PCI DSS, FedRAMP, each has requirements that cloud services must meet. If a service isn't certified, you can't use it for that purpose, regardless of technical capability. Acceptable use policies create operational boundaries. You're prohibited from certain activities, even if technically possible. No port scanning, no cryptocurrency mining on free-tier instances, no vulnerability research against provider infrastructure without permission. Violate these policies and your account gets suspended. The boundary is contractual. Pricing models create economic boundaries. Reserved instances lock you into specific configurations to get pricing discounts. Egress charges make certain architectures prohibitively expensive. The economics create boundaries as hard as technical ones, technically possible but economically impossible. And support SLAs define response boundaries. The free tier gets community support. Paying customers get 24-hour email response. Enterprise plans get 15-minute phone support for critical issues. The boundary is how fast the provider will help you when control breaks. So how do you operate effectively when surrounded by boundaries you can't cross? First, map your boundaries explicitly before you commit. Don't discover mid-migration that the cloud platform can't support a critical requirement. Direct. Identify your absolute requirements. Verify the platform can meet them. Find the boundaries early while you still have options. Design within constraints rather than fighting them. If you need hypervisor-level visibility and the cloud won't provide it, either implement compensating controls at the OS level or run on premises where you have that access. Trying to force the cloud to be something it isn't creates frustration and failure. Use boundaries as forcing functions for better architecture. Can't access the hypervisor. Forces you to implement security controls at layers you do control. Can't guarantee physical host separation. Forces you to encrypt everything and assume zero trust. Boundaries often push you toward more robust designs. Understand when boundaries are deal breakers. Some workloads genuinely can't run in public cloud because the boundaries are incompatible with requirements. High-frequency trading systems that need custom network hardware. Specialized computing that requires specific accelerators not available. Regulatory requirements that demand physical audits. When boundaries conflict with requirements, the answer is don't use cloud for that workload. Leverage hybrid and multi-cloud to work around provider-specific boundaries. One provider doesn't have a region in the country you need. Use a different provider for that workload. One platform doesn't support a specific database engine. Use a different platform. Boundaries become less constraining when you're not locked to a single provider. And accept that some control is meant to be surrendered. The whole point of cloud is delegating infrastructure management. If you need total control over every layer, you're not a good fit for cloud. But boundaries exist because abstraction requires limiting control. That's the trade-off. Control boundaries are where your authority ends and the provider's begins. They're set by technology, by business models, by security requirements, and by the fundamental architecture of shared infrastructure. We've covered a lot in this series: control loss, delegation, partial control, asymmetry, delay, degradation, and now boundaries. The through line. Controlling cloud computing is always constrained, always shared, always dependent on systems you don't fully manage. Understanding those constraints doesn't mean accepting powerlessness. It means making informed decisions about when cloud works and when it doesn't, what you can accomplish within boundaries and what requires different approaches. The boundary isn't the enemy. Fighting boundaries you can't change is the enemy. Knowing where they are, that's power. See you in the next series.